Winter 1945. The final months of the Third Reich. As Soviet troops stormed Berlin, one of the fiercest battles of the Great Patriotic War raged on in the depths of Silesia. 83 days of siege. 60,000 Soviet soldiers died. The city refused to surrender even after the fall of the Reich capital. What made people fight to the last bullet when the war was already lost? Today, we will tell the story of a fortress that did not surrender until the very end. The Battle of Breslau showed that even in a hopeless situation, people are capable of incredible feats. But are such sacrifices justified when the outcome of the war is already a foregone conclusion? Subscribe to our channel to learn more about the unknown pages of history. And in the comments, we will discuss the controversial question: was General Niehoff a hero defending his hometown, or a criminal who condemned thousands of people to a senseless death? The winter of 1944 was coming to an end when the fate of one of Silesia's largest cities was sealed. Breslau, an ancient city on the Oder River, which had stood at the crossroads of trade routes for several centuries, was preparing to become the arena of one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the final stage of World War II in Europe. This city, with a population of over 600,000, was to become the last bastion of the Third Reich, a fortress that would resist even after the fall of Berlin. Breslau's strategic location made it a key defensive point in Silesia. The city controlled important railway junctions and river crossings, connecting central Germany with the industrial areas of Upper Silesia. For the German command, holding Breslau meant preserving the last industrial region of the Reich, where military factories continued to operate until the very end of the war. For the Soviet command, capturing the city opened a direct route to the heart of Germany and allowed them to finally cut off the southern regions of the Reich from the center. Preparations for the defense began long before Soviet troops appeared at the city walls. Already in the fall of 1944, the Gauleiter of Lower Silesia, Karl Hanke, gave the order to turn Breslau into a fortress. Thousands of townspeople were mobilized to build defensive structures. Anti-tank ditches, barricades, pillboxes, and dugouts were erected throughout the city. Particular attention was paid to strengthening stone buildings, which were turned into real bastions with embrasures for machine guns and anti-tank guns. German engineers took advantage of all the features of the city's urban layout. Narrow medieval streets were blocked with barricades, creating a labyrinth of firing positions. Cellars were connected by underground passages, forming a whole network of shelters and supply routes. Industrial enterprises were turned into fortresses within the fortress, where each workshop became a separate center of resistance. Bridges across the Oder were mined, and in case of their loss, crossings were prepared using improvised means. Airfields occupied a special place in the defensive system. Several airfields operated in the city and its surroundings, which were supposed to ensure communication between the besieged garrison and the outside world. The main airfield was located in the Gandau district, east of the city. Additional runways were set up directly in city parks and on wide streets. The German command understood that in the event of encirclement, air supplies would be the only way to maintain the garrison's combat capability. By the beginning of 1945, the Breslau defense system was a multi-layered fortress ready for a long siege. But few of its creators could have imagined that these preparations would be put to the test during an 83-day siege that would last until the very last days of the war. January 1945 brought tragedy to Breslau, the scale of which only became apparent decades later. The approach of Soviet troops forced the Nazi leadership to decide to evacuate the civilian population from the city. What was intended to be an orderly evacuation of people to safe areas turned into one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the final months of the war. The tragedy of the Breslau refugees became a symbol of the chaos and cruelty that accompanied the collapse of the Third Reich. On January 20th, 1945, Gauleiter Hanke gave the order for the immediate evacuation of the entire civilian population of Breslau. The decision was made in haste, without proper preparation or organization. The authorities needed to rid the city of extra mouths so that all infrastructure could be devoted to defense. Almost 600,000 people had to leave their homes within a few days, in the middle of one of the harshest winters in the history of Central Europe. The temperature that January reached 20 degrees below zero. Snowdrifts made many roads virtually impassable. Railway communications were disrupted by constant Soviet air raids. In these conditions, hundreds of thousands of people, old folks, women, kids, were forced to set off on foot, carrying only the bare essentials. There was virtually no organized evacuation. Everyone saved themselves as best they could. Columns of refugees stretched for many kilometers along the snow-covered roads of Silesia. People walked without knowing exactly where they were going, hoping only to get as far away from the front line as possible. Many families lost each other in the chaos. Children lagged behind their parents, and the elderly could not keep up. Wagons carrying belongings got stuck in snowdrifts or broke down on the broken roads. Food quickly ran out, and people began to starve. The death toll in the refugee columns grew every day. The bodies of frozen people were left lying along the roads. There was simply no one to bury them, and no means of doing so. According to various estimates, between 80,000 and 100,000 people died during this exodus. Entire families disappeared in the snowy desert of Silesia, leaving no trace behind. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that many refugees were heading towards Dresden, which was destroyed by carpet bombing by Allied aircraft on February 13th to 14th. Among those who remained in the city were many people who simply did not believe in the seriousness of the threat or were unable to leave their homes. Some residents deliberately refused to evacuate, preferring to share the fate of their native city. These people, about 60,000 townspeople, found themselves hostages to the approaching battle. They had to endure almost 3 months of siege, hunger, constant bombing, and artillery fire. But for many of them, this was less evil than participating in the tragic events of January 1945. February 13, 1945, was a turning point in the fate of Breslau. On that day, units of the 6th Army under Colonel General Vladimir Glustovsky completed the encirclement of the city, cutting off the last routes of retreat for the German garrison. The siege began, which would last 82 days and go down in history as one of the most stubborn battles of the final stage of the Great Patriotic War. From that moment on, the fate of the ancient Silesian city was sealed, but the road to victory was long and bloody. The Soviet offensive in Silesia developed rapidly. The First Ukrainian Front, under the command of Marshal Ivan Konev, broke through the German defenses and advanced rapidly to the west. Breslau was off the main axis of the Soviet attack, which gave the German command hope of organizing an effective defense. However, the city's geographical position made its encirclement inevitable. Soviet troops bypassed Breslau from the north and south, like a river bending around an island. The 6th Army was tasked with isolating and capturing the city without distracting the main forces of the front, from their advance on Berlin. This decision by the Soviet command largely determined the protracted nature of the upcoming battles. Storming a fortress like Breslau required significant forces and resources, but the priority was to capture the capital of the Reich. General Glustovsky had to solve a difficult task with limited resources. By the time Breslau was surrounded, there was a significant garrison in the city. According to various sources, between 70,000 and 80,000 men were defending the city. These were not only regular Wehrmacht units, but also divisions of the Volkssturm, a militia formed from local residents. Many of the city's defenders were native Silesians who knew the area well and were motivated to put up a stubborn resistance. They were commanded by the experienced General Johannes Krause, who immediately set about organizing a circular defense. By February 1945, Breslau's fortifications were an impressive sight. The outer defensive belt ran through the suburbs and included numerous permanent firing points. Anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and wire barriers created a continuous line of defense. Inside the city, each district was prepared for autonomous defense. Underground communications linked strongholds, allowing reserves to be moved secretly and frontline positions to be supplied. The city's industrial enterprises played a special role in the defense. Machine-building plants continued to produce weapons and ammunition even under siege. Workers and engineers created improvised weapons, anti-tank mines from industrial explosives, homemade grenade launchers, and flamethrowers. Factory workshops were turned into fortresses, where every machine tool became part of a barricade. With the start of the siege, the entire way of life in the city changed. Strict rationing of food, fuel, and ammunition was introduced. Civilians were conscripted to build fortifications and work in military factories. Hospitals prepared for a massive influx of wounded soldiers. Schools and public buildings were converted into barracks and warehouses. Breslau was turning into a real military camp, ready for a long siege. The German defense of Breslau was a unique system that combined centuries of experience in European fortification with the latest military technology of the mid-20th century. The garrison consisted of diverse units, each with its own characteristics and combat capabilities. This motley army, united by a common goal of defending the city, managed to create one of the most effective defensive systems of the latter period of World War II. The core of the garrison was made up of regular Wehrmacht units. Among them was the 6th Infantry Division, which had extensive combat experience and was staffed by career military personnel. These soldiers had fought throughout the war, participated in battles on various fronts, and possessed high military training. They were supported by artillery and engineering units, tank units, and air defense units. The total number of regular troops was about 30,000. A significant part of the defenders were members of the Volkssturm, a militia formed from local residents. These people, many of whom were too old or too young for regular military service, compensated for their lack of military training with their excellent knowledge of the city and high motivation. They knew every street, every basement, and every attic in Breslau. There were about 40,000 of them, and they made up the bulk of the city's defenders. Units made up of Silesian residents played a special role in the defense. These people were not just fighting for abstract ideas, but for their homes, their families, and the land of their ancestors. Many of them spoke a local dialect that combined German and Polish elements. For them, Breslau was not just a city that had to be held by order, but a homeland that they were not going to give up without a fight. This emotional component made them exceptionally tenacious fighters. The Breslau fortification system was built taking into account the characteristics of the city's urban development. The outer defensive belt ran along the outskirts of the city and included more than 150 permanent firing points. These pillboxes and bunkers were built of reinforced concrete and could withstand direct hits from heavy shells. Each firing point was equipped with several embrasures, which allowed fire to be directed in different directions. Anti-tank obstacles created a continuous strip of barriers ranging from 200 to 500 meters wide. Ramparts, anti-tank ditches, and escarpments were supplemented by minefields and wire barriers. Particular attention was paid to covering the bridges across the Oder and its tributaries. Each crossing was turned into a powerful resistance hub capable of holding back the advancing enemy for a long time. Inside the city, a system of strongpoints was created, each of which could conduct autonomous defense. Stone buildings were converted into long-term fortifications. Embrasures were cut into the walls, and machine guns and anti-tank guns were installed. Basements were connected by underground passages, creating an extensive network of communications. The roofs of houses were turned into firing positions for snipers and machine gunners. German engineers took full advantage of the urban environment. The narrow streets of the old town were turned into deadly traps for enemy tanks. Barricades made of cobblestones and tram rails blocked the roads. Behind each barricade were firing points ready to meet the enemy with heavy fire. The defense system was so dense that every meter of the city was covered by fire from several positions at once. February 16, 1945, was the day of the first general assault on Breslau. The Soviet command was counting on a quick victory, believing that the demoralized garrison would be unable to put up serious resistance. However, these calculations proved to be a fatal mistake. The first assault turned into a bloody massacre, which showed all participants that taking the city would require much more effort and sacrifice than originally anticipated. The offensive began at dawn, with powerful artillery preparation. For 2 hours, Soviet guns fired on German positions, trying to suppress firing points and destroy fortifications. However, the effectiveness of this fire raid was low. The German pillboxes had been built with possible artillery strikes in mind, and most of the defenders took cover in underground shelters, waiting out the shelling. After the artillery preparation, Soviet tanks with infantry landed in the attack. This tactic had proven itself well in field battles, but in dense urban areas it proved ineffective and extremely dangerous. The T-34 tanks and heavy IS-2 tanks, which easily broke through the outer defense line, found themselves trapped in the narrow city streets, where their mobility was reduced to a minimum. It was here that German defenders first used a new anti-tank weapon on a large scale: disposable Panzerfaust grenade launchers. These simple and effective weapons against armored vehicles proved ideal for urban combat. Hiding in basements and attics, German soldiers and militiamen fired at Soviet tanks from a distance of 30 to 50 meters. Every street turned into a tank battle. During the first 3 days of the assault, Soviet troops lost 76 tanks. These were huge losses that seriously weakened the striking power of the advancing units. Most of the vehicles were knocked out in street fighting by Panzerfaust grenade launchers and anti-tank guns, which the Germans skillfully camouflaged in the ruins of buildings. Some tanks fell victim to improvised mines made from industrial explosives. Having lost the support of their armored vehicles, the Soviet infantry found themselves face-to-face with the enemy's well-trained defenses. German machine gun nests were positioned in such a way as to create dense fire zones covering all approaches to important targets. snipers, entrenched on roofs and in attics, methodically shot Soviet commanders and signalmen. Every building had to be taken with heavy fighting and significant losses. Particularly fierce fighting broke out in the industrial area of the city and behind the airfield in the suburbs. These objects were of strategic importance. Control of the factories deprived the Germans of the ability to produce ammunition, and the capture of the airfield would have cut off the garrison's air supply. However, the German defenders understood the importance of these positions and fought with particular tenacity. By the end of February, the Soviet command was forced to admit that Breslau could not be taken quickly. The losses of the first days of the assault forced a rethink of combat tactics. It became clear that a successful assault would require special units trained for urban combat, heavy artillery capable of destroying fortified buildings, and flamethrower units to burn the enemy out of basements and attics. The first assault on Breslau was a harsh lesson for the Soviet command. It showed that even in the final months of the war, German troops were capable of stubborn resistance, especially when defending cities. The experience gained in these battles required serious analysis and changes in street fighting tactics. The airbridge became the only link connecting besieged Breslau with the remnants of the Third Reich. After the city was surrounded, the German command realized that without constant air supplies, the garrison would not be able to hold out for long. Organizing the airbridge turned into a complex logistical operation that required the mobilization of all remaining transport aircraft of the Luftwaffe. This air lifeline operated under extreme conditions, under constant fire from Soviet anti-aircraft gunners and fighter planes. The airbridge was based on Junkers J-52 transport aircraft, the workhorses of German aviation. These three-engine aircraft, designed back in the 1930s, were already considered obsolete by 1945, but it was their reliability and ability to operate from primitive airfields that made them indispensable for supplying the besieged garrisons. They were joined by Junkers Ju-88 and Heinkel He-111 bombers, converted for transport. Initially, German aircraft landed directly at the Gandau airfield, located east of the city. However, as the front line approached, this airfield came under increasingly heavy fire from Soviet artillery. Every landing and takeoff became a deadly adventure. Soviet snipers specifically hunted down the crews of transport aircraft, while anti-aircraft artillery created a dense curtain of fire over the airfield. After losing their main airfield, the Germans were forced to use improvised runways set up directly in the city. The wide Kaiserstrasse was turned into an open-air airfield. Tram wires were removed, the road surface was leveled, and landing lights were installed along the edges of the improvised runway. These operations were carried out only at night to avoid detection by Soviet aerial reconnaissance. But even using city streets as runways did not solve all the problems. As Soviet air defenses around the city grew stronger, many planes simply could not reach their destinations. The German command then resorted to dropping cargo by parachute. Transport aircraft approached the city at high altitude, dropped containers with ammunition, medicines, and food, and then quickly left the anti-aircraft artillery's range. The Soviet command understood perfectly well the importance of interrupting the enemy's air supply. A special air defense force was created to combat German transport aircraft. The 71st Anti-Aircraft Artillery Division was tasked with creating an impenetrable curtain of fire over Breslau. It was joined by the 173rd Fighter Aviation Regiment, whose pilots specialized in intercepting transport aircraft. The statistics of air operations over Breslau are impressive in their scale. From March to May 1945, Soviet anti-aircraft gunners and pilots recorded 622 German aircraft flights over the besieged city. This means that almost every night, air duels took place in the skies over Silesia between Luftwaffe transport aircraft and Soviet interceptors. The losses of the German Air Force were significant. 38 aircraft were shot down by anti-aircraft fire alone, not counting those that fell victim to Soviet fighters or were forced to make emergency landings. Each transport aircraft shot down meant not only the loss of expensive equipment and experienced crew, but also the disruption of critical supplies to the besieged city. Nevertheless, the airbridge continued to function until the very last days of the siege. German pilots showed incredible courage, fighting their way through a dense curtain of fire to reach their comrades. Many of them made several sorties per night, risking their lives to deliver a few tons of ammunition or medical supplies. This airbridge became a symbol of the desperate resistance of the besieged garrison and at the same time showed the limits of even the most advanced military aviation of the time. On March 2, 1945, a new chapter began in the history of the defense of Breslau. On that day, command of the besieged fortress was taken over by Major General Hermann Niehoff, an experienced military leader who had fought on various fronts during his career and proved himself a talented tactician and organizer of defenses. Niehoff's appointment radically changed the nature of the city's resistance. The new commander not only reorganized the defense system, but also introduced innovative elements that significantly increased its effectiveness. Hermann Niehoff belonged to a generation of German military men who gained combat experience in World War I and then honed their skills during World War II. He participated in battles in France, the Balkans, and on the Eastern Front. His experience in defensive operations, gained in the battles near Leningrad and during the Wehrmacht's retreat in 1943 to 1944, was particularly valuable. Niehoff understood the peculiarities of urban warfare and knew how to make the most of the advantages of the defending side. The first thing the new commandant did was to conduct a thorough analysis of the results of the February battles. He identified weaknesses in the city's defenses and realized that the traditional system of linear defense was ineffective in urban warfare. Instead of trying to hold a continuous front line, Niehoff proposed creating a system of strongholds, each of which could conduct autonomous circular defense, even if the enemy broke through in neighboring areas. The central element of the new tactic was the so-called Niehoff line, a defensive system that ran not along the outskirts of the city, but within the neighborhoods. This decision seemed paradoxical. The commandant was voluntarily giving up part of the city's territory to the enemy. However, this tactic had a profound meaning. By moving the line of defense deeper into the neighborhoods, German troops were able to use stone buildings as natural fortifications and create a multi-layered system of fire. Each stronghold was a group of buildings adapted for circular defense. The basements were connected by underground passages, which allowed reserves and ammunition to be moved secretly. Machine gun nests and positions for anti-tank guns were set up on the first floors. The upper floors and attics were turned into sniper positions and observation posts. The roofs were used to place light mortars and anti-aircraft machine guns. Niehoff paid particular attention to the organization of artillery support. He created a centralized fire control system that allowed all firepower to be quickly concentrated on the most threatened areas. Artillery and mortar batteries were located in the basements of sturdy stone buildings, which protected them from enemy counter-battery fire. The positions of the guns were changed after each fire raid, making them difficult to detect and suppress. Niehoff also reorganized the supply and replenishment system. He created mobile reserves that could be quickly transferred to threatened areas. Particular attention was paid to the training of assault groups, small but well-trained units capable of conducting counterattacks and restoring positions on critical sections of the front. The new defense tactics required a major overhaul of the entire troop command system. Niehoff created a flexible communication system based on radio and backed up by wired lines laid through underground communications. Each stronghold had direct contact with the command, which allowed for quick reactions to changes in the situation and coordination between different defense areas. The results of Niehoff's innovations were already evident in March 1945. Soviet troops, accustomed to a certain type of German resistance, encountered a fundamentally different defense system. Every meter of urban territory had to be won in heavy fighting, with heavy losses. The Niehoff line became a serious obstacle on the Soviet troops' way to the city center and significantly slowed down the pace of the offensive. The Underground War became one of the most dramatic and little-known episodes of the Battle of Breslau. While street fighting raged on the surface, an equally fierce battle was unfolding beneath the city in a labyrinth of sewer collectors, basements, and specially dug tunnels. This hidden battle required not only military skill from its participants, but also nerves of steel and the ability to fight in complete darkness, under constant fear of collapse and the threat of flooding. The underground communications of Breslau were a complex system that had been created over several centuries. Medieval cellars were connected to later cellars, and sewer tunnels were intertwined with water supply and heating systems. By the beginning of the siege, this underground network had been further expanded with specially dug communication passages that connected the main defense points. German sappers and militiamen turned the city's underground passages into a veritable fortress. Key points in the underground network were reinforced with reinforced concrete slabs and equipped with machine gun nests. The basements housed ammunition depots, hospitals, command posts, and weapon repair shops. Some underground rooms were so spacious that they could accommodate entire units with full equipment. Soviet troops quickly realized the importance of underground warfare. Special assault groups were formed to fight in the tunnels, manned by volunteers from among the most experienced fighters. These units were armed with PPSH submachine guns, hand grenades, demolition charges, and portable flamethrowers. Special attention was paid to training signalmen, who were responsible for maintaining communication between underground groups and ground units. The techniques of underground combat differed radically from conventional infantry tactics. In narrow tunnels, where visibility was limited to a few meters, hearing, intuition, and the ability to react instantly became crucial. Fighters learned to distinguish between the sounds of footsteps, breathing, and the clang of weapons. Every turn in the tunnel could conceal an enemy ambush, and every suspicious sound could signal the start of an attack. Mine warfare became particularly fierce in the underground tunnels of Breslau. Both sides actively used explosives to destroy enemy positions and create blockages in the tunnels. German sappers, who knew the underground topography of the city well, often set traps, mined sections of tunnels that exploded when the enemy approached. Soviet sappers responded by blowing up entire neighborhoods under which important German targets were located. Attempts to flood underground communications were particularly dangerous. Both sides tried to use the city's water supply and sewage systems to flood enemy positions. The Germans, who controlled most of the city's engineering communications, tried several times to flood the tunnels occupied by Soviet troops. However, these attempts often backfired as the water spread throughout the entire network of underground passages. The psychological impact of the underground fighting on the participants was enormous. The constant darkness, stuffiness, and inability to determine the number and location of the enemy created an atmosphere of constant tension. Many fighters could not withstand the nervous strain of underground warfare and asked to be transferred to ground units. The command of both sides was forced to regularly change the units fighting in the tunnels. The underground war in Breslau continued until the very last days of the siege. Even when Soviet troops controlled most of the city, groups of German soldiers and militiamen continued to hide in the underground tunnels and wage a guerrilla war. Some of these groups surrendered only a few days after the official surrender of the garrison, when it became clear that resistance was futile. The experience of underground combat in Breslau became an important lesson for the development of urban warfare tactics. It showed that modern warfare is not limited to the surface of the earth, but extends to all three dimensions, including underground communications. This experience was taken into account in subsequent conflicts and influenced the development of military art in the second half of the 20th century. March 1945 was a time of protracted positional battles that exhausted both sides and turned Breslau into a ghost town where death lurked around every corner. Convinced that a quick assault was impossible, Soviet troops resorted to a tactic of methodically gnawing away at the German defenses. Every building, every street, every basement became an arena of fierce fighting. Casualties grew with each passing day, but the front line moved forward by only a few meters at a time. The Soviet command was forced to radically revise its tactics. It became clear that massive tank attacks in dense urban areas were ineffective and led to unjustified losses of equipment. Instead, a new tactic was developed using assault groups, small units of 10 to 15 men specially trained for combat in buildings. Each assault group included machine gunners, grenade launchers, sappers, and flamethrowers. Their task was to capture individual buildings or even parts of them. The groups operated under the cover of artillery and with the support of individual tanks or self-propelled guns. However, the main role was played by the infantry, which had to drive the enemy out of every basement and attic. The artillery was given new tasks. Instead of massive fire raids on open areas, the guns switched to precision strikes on specific buildings. To destroy particularly strong fortifications, high-powered weapons were used, including heavy 152mm howitzers and 122mm cannons. Flamethrower units proved particularly effective. POF backpack flamethrowers and heavy TOS flamethrower units allowed the enemy to be burned out of basements and attics, where the artillery could not reach. However, the use of flamethrowers required exceptional courage from the fighters. Flamethrower operators became priority targets for German snipers and suffered huge losses. The German side also adapted to the new conditions of combat. General Niehoff created mobile reserves that could be quickly transferred to threatened areas. These reserves consisted of the most experienced soldiers and were armed with automatic weapons and anti-tank weapons. Their task was not to hold their positions at any cost, but to inflict maximum losses on the advancing enemy and then retreat to pre-prepared positions. Sniper warfare reached unprecedented levels in Breslau. Both sides brought in their best marksmen, who hunted each other down in the ruins of the city. Every window and every crack in the wall could hide a deadly threat. Soviet snipers specialized in taking out German officers and observers, while German marksmen hunted Soviet commanders and signalmen. Soviet losses in the March battles were significant. In the first half of the month alone, the Sixth Army lost more than 8,000 men killed and wounded. These were huge numbers for battles for a single city, especially considering that the territorial gains were minimal. Every captured block was paid for with dozens of Soviet soldiers' lives. Particularly, heavy fighting broke out for the city's industrial enterprises. German engineers had turned factory buildings into veritable fortresses. Thick reinforced concrete walls, labyrinthine production facilities, and underground communications created ideal conditions for defense. Each factory had to be stormed, resulting in huge losses. March also saw serious supply problems for both sides. The Soviet troops, engaged in protracted battles, needed constant replenishment of ammunition, especially artillery shells and grenades. The German garrison suffered from a shortage of everything, from ammunition to medicines. The airbridge was increasingly disrupted by the strengthening of Soviet air defense. By the end of March, it was clear that a quick end to the siege was not to be expected. Both sides prepared for a long and grueling struggle, the outcome of which would be decided not by brilliant maneuvers, but by stubbornness, endurance, and the ability to suffer losses in order to achieve their goal. April 1945 brought the last glimmer of hope for the besieged garrison in Breslau, and, at the same time, the fiercest fighting of the entire siege. The Easter Battle, as these events were later called, was the final attempt by German troops to break through the encirclement and join the remnants of Army Group Center. This operation required the city's defenders to mobilize all their remaining reserves and was the final act in the drama unfolding in the ruins of the ancient Silesian city. The breakthrough plan was developed at Hitler's headquarters and involved a simultaneous attack from inside and outside the city. The Breslau garrison was to strike westward, while units of Army Group Center under Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner attempted to break through the encirclement from the outside. The coordination of these actions required precise timing and exceptional courage on the part of those involved in the operation. On April 12th, the day of Orthodox Easter, German troops launched their offensive. The strike was delivered on a narrow section of the front near Opole, where the Soviet defenses were relatively weak. The last combat-ready units of the garrison, about 2,000 men, supported by several tanks and assault guns that had been preserved until that moment, went on the offensive. The surprise attack ensured initial success for the Germans. The Soviet troops did not expect the besieged garrison to be capable of active action after 2 months of exhausting fighting. German assault groups broke through the first line of Soviet defenses and advanced several hundred meters. For a short time, it seemed that the breakthrough plan might succeed. However, the Soviet command quickly responded to the change in the situation. Reserves of the Sixth Army were urgently transferred to the threatened sector. Assault aircraft took to the air and launched massive strikes against the advancing German columns. Heavy IS-2 tanks and Su-152 self-propelled guns created an insurmountable barrier in the path of the German troops. At the same time, an attempt to break the blockade from the outside also failed. Units of Army Group Center that had launched an offensive in the direction of Breslau encountered strong Soviet defenses and were unable to overcome the resistance. By this time, Soviet reserves had been brought up to the breakthrough area, and the German offensive faltered without achieving its objectives. By the evening of April 13th, it was clear that the operation had failed. German troops suffered heavy losses and were forced to retreat to their original positions. Of the 2,000 participants in the breakthrough, less than half remained in formation. The losses in equipment were catastrophic. Almost all tanks and assault guns were destroyed or damaged. The Easter battle was a turning point in the defense of Breslau. The failure of the breakthrough attempt completely demoralized the city's defenders. It became clear that there was no hope for outside help and that their own forces were exhausted. Many soldiers and militiamen began to doubt the advisability of continuing the resistance. General Niehoff tried to raise the morale of his troops, explaining the failure by unfavorable circumstances. However, experienced soldiers understood the real situation. Ammunition was running out, food supplies were dwindling every day, and the number of combat-ready soldiers was steadily decreasing. The airbridge was operating increasingly irregularly, and every container dropped with supplies became the subject of fierce fighting. After the failure of the Easter offensive, the nature of the fighting changed. German troops finally switched to passive defense, focusing on holding key positions in the city center. Encouraged by their success, Soviet troops intensified their offensive, seeking to take advantage of the enemy's weakness and end the siege as quickly as possible. The Easter battle in Breslau became a symbol of desperate resistance and, at the same time, the beginning of the end for the besieged garrison. It showed that even in a hopeless situation, people are capable of heroic deeds. But it also demonstrated the limits of human capabilities in modern warfare. The lives of civilians in besieged Breslau turned into a daily struggle for survival, where each new day could be their last. About 60,000 townspeople who refused to evacuate or did not manage to leave the city before it was surrounded found themselves hostages to military operations. Their existence in the cauldron became a tragic example of how war mercilessly destroys the lives of ordinary people, turning everyday life into a continuous nightmare of hunger, fear, and death. From the very beginning of the siege, food supplies to the population were extremely poorly organized. The German command expected the city to be quickly unblocked and did not create sufficient food reserves for a prolonged siege. By the end of February, bread rations had been reduced to 125 grams per person per day. This amount barely covered the minimum requirements of the human body and was significantly less than the blockade rations in Leningrad. Hunger became a constant companion for the inhabitants of the besieged city. People ate anything that could somehow satisfy their hunger. Leather goods, wood glue, grass, and tree bark. Children and the elderly suffered particularly, as their bodies could not cope with constant malnutrition. Child mortality reached catastrophic levels. Several dozen children died every day in the city. Medical care was virtually unavailable to the civilian population. All doctors and nurses were mobilized to work in military hospitals, where wounded soldiers were treated. Medicines were reserved exclusively for military needs. Civilians could only count on primitive first aid and folk remedies. Epidemics of infectious diseases caused by unsanitary conditions and weakened bodies killed people by the dozens. Living conditions deteriorated with each passing day. Constant artillery shelling and bombing destroyed homes, leaving people homeless. Thousands of families were forced to live in basements, bomb shelters, and underground tunnels. These makeshift dwellings lacked basic amenities such as heating, water supply, and sewage systems. People lived in darkness, dampness, and cold, which contributed to the spread of disease. The situation was particularly difficult for women with children. Men were either fighting at the front or had been mobilized to build fortifications. Women were left alone to face the challenges of survival. They had to not only care for their children, but also find food, keep their homes livable, and look after the sick and wounded. The psychological state of the population deteriorated with each passing day. Constant fear of death, uncertainty about the future, hunger, and disease undermined the will to live. Many people fell into apathy and lost interest in what was happening around them. Suicide became a sad reality in the besieged city. People saw no way out of their hopeless situation and voluntarily took their own lives. Children born and raised in peacetime found themselves in the midst of military operations. Many of them lost their parents, were left orphaned, and were forced to fight for survival on their own. These children grew up quickly, learning to find food, avoid danger, and help the wounded. Their childhood was stolen by the war and replaced by a struggle for basic survival. The German authorities tried to use the civilian population for military purposes. Men of draft age were mobilized into the Volkssturm. Women were recruited to work in hospitals and military factories. Teenagers were used as couriers and observers. Even children participated in defensive work, carrying ammunition and helping the wounded. The social structure of the city was completely destroyed. The familiar institutions of civil society, schools, theaters, libraries, disappeared. Churches were turned into hospitals or ammunition depots. Normal life ceased, giving way to a primitive struggle for survival. People formed small groups of several families to jointly solve problems of obtaining food and protection from danger. By the end of April, the situation of the civilian population had become critical. Deaths from starvation and disease exceeded military casualties. According to various estimates, between 18,000 and 25,000 civilians died during the siege, almost half of those who remained in the city at the start of the encirclement. April 30th, 1945, became a fateful milestone in the history of the Third Reich. On that day, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. News of the Führer's death reached the defenders of Breslau only a few days later, but its impact on the morale of the garrison was catastrophic. Soldiers and militiamen, who had previously fought in the hope of a miracle, the appearance of a new wonder weapon, or help from outside the encirclement, suddenly realized that their sacrifices were in vain and that the war was already lost. On May 2nd, the capital of the Reich fell. Berlin, a city that had seemed impregnable, a symbol of German power and greatness, surrendered after fierce street fighting. The news reached Breslau through Soviet radio intercepts and the testimony of prisoners. The German command tried to hide the truth from its troops, but rumors spread like wildfire. Soldiers began to realize that they were not fighting for victory, but merely delaying inevitable defeat. The psychological impact of the fall of Berlin on the defenders of Breslau was enormous. Many soldiers and officers asked themselves, why continue the resistance if the war is already over? Why make new sacrifices if the outcome is a foregone conclusion? These thoughts undermined the morale of the troops much more effectively than any Soviet propaganda leaflets or radio broadcasts. General Niehoff found himself in an extremely difficult position. On the one hand, he had orders to fight to the last soldier, but on the other, he understood the futility of further resistance. The new government of Admiral Dönitz, which came to power after Hitler's death, had not yet decided on a strategy for waging war. In these circumstances, the commandant of Breslau was forced to make decisions on his own, based on his own understanding of the situation. Discipline in the German units began to break down. Desertions became more frequent, although there was practically nowhere to desert from the surrounded city. Some Volkssturm units simply stopped carrying out their combat tasks, and their fighters dispersed to their homes and families. Officers lost control of their soldiers, who increasingly refused to go into battle or take up particularly dangerous positions. Upon receiving information about the fall of Berlin, the Soviet command intensified its propaganda efforts against the enemy. Radio broadcasts constantly reported on the surrender of various German units and cities. Leaflets calling for surrender and promising safe passage were dropped behind enemy lines. This propaganda fell on fertile ground. Many defenders of Breslau were already ready to believe in the possibility of an honorable surrender. The news of the fall of the capital was particularly hard to take for the city's residents. For them, Berlin was not just an administrative center, but a symbol of the German state. Its fall meant the end of the world they knew, and the collapse of all hopes for a favorable outcome of the war. Many townspeople began to blame the military command for prolonging the agony and unwillingness to end the senseless slaughter. By early May, the material situation of the city's defenders had become critical. The airbridge had practically ceased to function. Most transport aircraft had been diverted to other destinations or destroyed by Soviet aviation. Ammunition was running out, with a particularly acute shortage of artillery shells and anti-tank weapons. Food supplies were running out, and there were not even enough medicines to provide first aid to the wounded. Under these conditions, unrest began to spread among the garrison officers. Many of them, especially those who had families in other regions of Germany, increasingly spoke out in favor of ending the resistance. They understood that every additional day of war meant new casualties among soldiers and civilians without any military purpose. General Niehoff attempted to hold a meeting with his subordinates to develop a unified position on further actions. However, opinions were divided. Some officers insisted on following orders and continuing the resistance to the end. Others were inclined to begin negotiations for surrender. Still others suggested attempting to break out of the encirclement in small groups. The fall of Berlin and Hitler's death marked the beginning of the end for the Breslau garrison. Although fighting continued for several more days, the psychological resistance had been broken. The city's defenders understood that their struggle had become a senseless waste of human lives, that history had already passed its verdict, and that all that remained was to accept defeat with dignity. The first days of May 1945 were a time of agonizing deliberation for the Breslau garrison command. General Niehoff faced a difficult dilemma: continue the futile resistance, carrying out the last orders of the collapsed Reich, or negotiate with the Soviet command for an honorable surrender. Every hour of delay resulted in new casualties among soldiers and civilians. At the same time, the German general understood the full responsibility of his decision before history and before those who had entrusted their lives to him. On May 3rd, the Soviet command made a final attempt to persuade the enemy to surrender without a storm. Under a white flag, a delegation led by Major General Alexander Semenovich Xenofontov headed for the German positions. The Soviet representatives had the authority to negotiate the surrender of the city on honorable terms. They guaranteed the lives of all the garrison personnel, allowed the officers to keep their cold weapons, and promised qualified medical assistance to the wounded. The negotiations took place in a tense atmosphere. General Niehoff hesitated, understanding on the one hand the hopelessness of the situation, and on the other, fearing to violate his military oath. His officers were divided into two camps. Some insisted on continuing the resistance, citing their duty as soldiers and the honor of their weapons. Others called for prudence, pointing to the futility of further sacrifices after the fall of Berlin and Hitler's suicide. The garrison doctors were particularly active in calling for an end to the resistance. The chief physician of the city's military hospitals presented the command with terrible statistics. In the last week alone, more than 1,200 people had died from wounds, starvation, and disease. The medics were unable to help even the seriously wounded, as they had run out of all medicines and bandages. Continuing the fighting would mean a painful death for hundreds of wounded soldiers. Representatives of the civilian population also appealed to General Niehoff with a petition to cease resistance. The mayor and prominent citizens pointed out that a real plague had begun among the civilian population. Every day, dozens of people were dying, mainly children and the elderly. The city's infrastructure was completely destroyed, with no running water, sewage, or electricity. The city was reduced to a pile of rubble, where doomed people were living out their last days. On May 4th, the situation became even more tense. Soviet troops received reinforcements and prepared for a decisive assault on the central part of the city. Intelligence reported that additional artillery units and assault aircraft were moving towards Breslau. It was obvious that if the negotiations were not successful, the final assault would turn into a bloody massacre in which thousands of people would die. On the evening of May 4th, General Niehoff made a decision that was extremely difficult for him. He agreed to negotiate surrender, but put forward a number of conditions. The German side demanded guarantees of safety for all personnel of the garrison, including the Volkssturm units. Special guarantees were required for the civilian population of the city. Niehoff insisted that the townspeople be treated as civilians and not as accomplices of the Nazi regime. The negotiations dragged on for several hours. The Soviet side was generally ready to accept the Germans' terms, but insisted on unconditional surrender without any special conditions. General Gludzowski stated that the time for negotiations had been lost, and that if the Germans did not lay down their arms by the morning of May 5th, a general assault would follow with all the ensuing consequences. The night of May 4th to 5th was the last night of the war for the defenders of Breslau. Meetings of soldiers and officers were held throughout the city to discuss surrender. The majority voted to end the resistance. Many soldiers simply abandoned their positions without waiting for official orders. By morning, the city's defense system had virtually collapsed. On May 5th, at 5 a.m., General Niehoff signed the Act of Surrender of the Breslau garrison. This document ended the 83-day siege and was one of the last acts of surrender in Europe during World War II. The war ended for the defenders of the Silesian fortress just one day before Germany's general surrender. The news of the surrender was met with mixed reactions. Some felt relief that the suffering was over. Others felt the bitterness of defeat and shame at not having been able to fulfill their duty as soldiers to the end. But everyone understood that it was not just the battle for the city that had ended, but an entire era in European history. On May 6, 1945, at 6:30 in the morning, a white flag of surrender was raised over the ruins of Breslau. The 83-day siege, one of the longest urban battles of World War II in Europe, had come to an end. General Niehoff, having made the painful decision to surrender the city, ordered all units of the garrison to cease resistance and lay down their arms. This day marked the end of a tragic chapter in the history of the ancient Silesian city, and, at the same time, liberation for thousands of people whose lives had been hanging by a thread. The surrender ceremony took place in a solemn but tense atmosphere. Soviet troops, who just a few hours earlier had been preparing for a decisive assault, watched with disbelief as columns of German soldiers emerged from the ruins of the city with their hands raised. Many Red Army soldiers could not believe that the grueling battle had finally ended without a final bloodbath. Too many comrades had fallen on the approaches to this city for victory to come so easily. General Niehoff personally appeared at the Soviet headquarters to formalize the surrender. This 50-year-old military leader, who had fought in 2 world wars, looked exhausted and aged. His face bore the traces of the inhuman strain of the last few months. Handing his saber to General Gludzovsky, he made a short speech in which he expressed his hope for the humane treatment of prisoners and the civilian population of the city. The surrender of weapons continued throughout the day. German soldiers emerged from basements and ruins, emaciated and ragged, but still maintaining their military bearing. Many of them were wounded, but continued to serve until the last day. Along with the regular troops, units of the Volkssturm, local residents who had defended their hometown with weapons in their hands, also surrendered. The total number of prisoners was about 40,000. Soviet soldiers were surprised to find many women and teenagers in military uniforms in the city. They were nurses, signalers, anti-aircraft gunners, and even teenage girls who carried ammunition and helped the wounded. Their participation in the defense of the city showed how much the German command had to mobilize all human resources to keep fighting. The liberation of the civilian population was one of the most moving moments of Breslau's surrender. Emaciated people emerged from underground shelters, basements, and ruins. Women with children, the elderly, and the sick. Many of them were so weakened by hunger and disease that they could not move on their own. Soviet military medics immediately began to help the victims, setting up field hospitals right on the streets of the city. The scene of destruction that met the Soviet troops was horrific. All that remained of the once beautiful city were piles of rubble. The central square was pockmarked with shell craters, and the cathedral and town hall lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to mountains of broken bricks and reinforced concrete debris. Many streets were so littered with debris that it was impossible to drive through them even in a tank. The state of the city's industrial enterprises was particularly shocking. The factories and plants that had continued to produce weapons and ammunition for the defenders until the very last day were now nothing more than twisted metal structures. Unfinished shells, weapon parts, and machine tools shattered by explosions lay scattered across the workshops. All this testified to the fact that the city had resisted to the last. It took several days to count the losses. Soviet troops lost about 60,000 men killed and wounded, a huge number for the capture of a single city. German losses were even greater. Less than half of the 80,000-strong garrison survived. The civilian population suffered about 25,000 casualties. These figures show the price both sides paid for victory. The surrender of Breslau took place just 2 days before the general surrender of Germany. The city became one of the last pockets of resistance to the Nazi regime in Europe. Its fall symbolized the final collapse of the Third Reich and the end of the bloodiest war in human history on the European theater of war. For the city's residents, May 6th was a day of liberation from a 3-month nightmare. Many cried with joy that they had survived and that their suffering was finally over. Others mourned their lost loved ones and destroyed homes, but everyone understood that a new chapter in the history of their city and their lives had begun. In his order to the troops, General Gluzdovsky noted the courage and fortitude shown by Soviet soldiers during the capture of Breslau. He emphasized that this victory was the result of the heroism of thousands of soldiers and officers who sacrificed their lives for the victory over fascism. The fall of the last Nazi stronghold was a fitting end to the Red Army's long journey from the walls of Moscow to the heart of Europe. The siege of Breslau ended, leaving a deep mark on the history of World War II and military art. 83 days of fierce fighting, 60,000 Soviet soldiers killed, 40,000 casualties among the city's defenders, and 25,000 civilian casualties. These figures speak for themselves. The battle for the ancient Silesian city became one of the bloodiest and longest urban battles in the history of warfare, and left many lessons for future generations of military personnel. The strategic importance of Breslau's defense for the German side was ambiguous. On the one hand, the city tied down significant forces of the Red Army that could have been used in the Berlin direction. General Glusko's Sixth Army was completely diverted to the siege, which somewhat weakened the group of Soviet troops advancing on the capital of the Reich. On the other hand, the stubborn defense of Breslau did not change the overall course of the war, and only delayed Germany's inevitable defeat. The tactical lessons of the Battle of Breslau proved to be extremely important for the development of military art. The battle showed that in modern warfare, an urban environment can become a virtually impregnable fortress with competent defense organization. General Niehoff's system of strong points, the use of underground communications, and the transformation of every building into a fortress all became classic examples of urban defense. Soviet troops gained invaluable experience in storming fortified cities. The tactics of assault groups, the coordination of infantry, artillery, and aviation, and the use of flamethrowers, all these elements were tested in the battles for Breslau and subsequently applied in other operations. The experience of underground combat was particularly important, demonstrating the need for special training for troops operating in tunnels and basements. The psychological aspect of the siege also deserves attention. The battle showed that the morale of the troops is crucial in a prolonged siege. As long as the defenders believed in the possibility of victory, or at least of breaking the blockade, they fought with exceptional tenacity. But as soon as it became clear that the war was lost, the resistance quickly collapsed. The role of the civilian population in the siege of Breslau became a tragic page in history. Civilians found themselves hostages to the military ambitions of the political leadership. Their suffering was in vain and brought no military advantage. This experience demonstrated the need to evacuate civilians from combat zones and the inadmissibility of using cities with civilian populations as fortresses. The airbridge organized by the German side demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of air supply to besieged garrisons. With enemy air superiority and a powerful air defense system, air supply becomes an extremely risky and ineffective undertaking. The Luftwaffe's transport aircraft losses during the supply of Breslau were catastrophic. The engineering aspect of the city's defense deserves special study. German sappers and builders created a unique system of fortifications that made maximum use of the city's urban layout. Underground communications, the conversion of buildings into pillboxes, and the creation of a multi-tiered fire system all became models for study in post-war military academies. The medical aspect of the siege revealed the critical importance of organizing medical care in urban combat conditions. The large number of wounded limited evacuation capabilities and shortages of medicines and personnel all required new approaches to organizing medical services in combat conditions. The Battle of Breslau was the last major battle of the Great Patriotic War on European soil. It marked the end of the Soviet Army's long journey from defense to complete victory over Nazi Germany. In this sense, the fall of the Silesian fortress had not only military but also symbolic significance. The post-war fate of the city was dramatic. Breslau, renamed Wrocław, was returned to Poland. The German population was deported, and the city was repopulated by Poles. The wartime ruins were restored, but the memory of the tragic events of the spring of 1945 has been preserved in historical documents and the memories of those who participated. The study of the siege of Breslau remains relevant for modern military specialists. In an era of urbanization, when most of the world's population lives in cities, the experience of urban warfare takes on special significance. The lessons of the Silesian fortress help to understand the patterns of street fighting and avoid the mistakes of the past. The human dimension of the Breslau tragedy must not be forgotten. Behind the dry statistics lie the fates of thousands of people, soldiers and civilians who fell victim to the last battle of a war that had already been lost. Their sacrifice reminds us of the price of military adventures and the need for peaceful resolution of international conflicts.